Our fourth and final speech of the evening, and our eighth overall, Hayden Wehrman, Robo Sapiens, How Artificial Intelligence Fits into Human Society.
Imagine a household 100 years in the future, equipped with all the latest advances in technology. Among these devices is a new emotional and logical system with improved emulation, or ELSI for short, which offers a substantial upgrade over our modern assistants like Alexa or Siri. Compared to these devices, ELSI is incredibly advanced, with a speech system indistinguishable from that of a human and a personality of her own. Over time, her owner will naturally grow attached to her. After all, she's basically human. She even reads bedtime stories and makes calls for you. The emotions she seems to feel and the companionship she provides are almost indistinguishable from those of her owners. Now, what happens when someone breaks into her house and steals or destroys her? How would her owner respond? How should her owner respond? Would this crime be a property crime or a personal crime? Without being in that situation, we can't give a definitive answer as to what the right choice would be. Regardless, it's obvious that an AI like Elsie could present complex challenges. This story may be speculation, but such an event is not out of the question in the future. As technology continues to advance around us, it is paramount that we discuss issues that may arise before they actually present themselves. Artificial intelligence, simply defined, is any device that mimics human cognitive function and can act independently of human instruction. It presents an especially unique challenge. How do we deal with something that isn't human, acting like a human? What place would AI have in society if it was advanced enough to convincingly imitate human behavior? As we learned from that story, there's no clear-cut answers right now. But without a path forward, we'll find ourselves with no answers when the moment arrives. To explore this issue, we'll discuss personhood as it relates to AI, the differences between AI and humans, and some potential futures that could arise. In the end, it will be shown that although AI is an impressive tool, it should be kept under control and separate from human beings. Before we can start off with questions about AI personhood, we have to decide what a person actually is. Humans aren't like machines driven by gears and circuits. Man is made in God's image and has an immaterial soul. In the end, the question of personhood comes down to the value we assign to something. Humans draw their value from two places: God, for our intrinsic value, and society, for our social value. AI, as a human creation, isn't made in the image of God, it's made in the image of man. So an AI like Elsie doesn't have the same intrinsic value that humans have by being image bearers of God, but she could still have the same amount of social value. Just as humanity reflects many of God's attributes, AI reflects many of humanity's attributes, including intelligence, rationality, and like Elsie, maybe emotions, empathy, and morality in the future. This leads to yet another question. How human-like can AI really get, and do human characteristics entitle it to human treatment? Right now, AI's defining characteristic is its ability to process massive amounts of data far faster than humans can. This enables it to perform a number of either very complex or very menial tasks that humans can't or don't want to do. The most advanced AI, like an early version of Elsie, is capable of imitating human behavior in limited ways, but therein lies its flaw. It can only imitate, it cannot create. American philosopher John Searle explored this point in his famous Chinese room argument. In this thought experiment, Searle imagines that he is locked inside of a room with a computer that can translate Chinese. Searle does not know any Chinese himself, but outside the room are native Chinese speakers that write down messages and slip them under the door. Searle takes these messages, inputs the characters into the computer, writes down what the computer gives him, and puts it back under the door. Now, from the perspective of the Chinese speakers, whoever's inside that room knows perfect Chinese. But inside the room, Searle hasn't learned anything about the language. He's just taking the information given to him, interpreting it based on rules that already exist and were given to him, and outputting a result. AI works in the same way. It recognizes patterns and consistency in the information it processes, but it has no actual understanding of the knowledge it gains. If Elsie is asked what color a tomato is, she'll quickly respond that it's red, but to her, red is not a color. It's a wavelength of light perceived in a certain way by the human eye that we call red. It's the difference between someone who reads travel books and someone who actually goes on vacation. Both of them have knowledge about vacations. The one who reads travel books might even have more knowledge, but only one of them has actual experience and understanding of what it's like to go on vacation. Now that we know how AI functions, we can relate it back to the human mind. Most people who think about the mind belong to one of two camps: physicalism, the belief that everything in existence is physical, including the mind, or dualism, the belief that the mind is fundamentally different from the rest of the body. These schools are both extremes, and as they both have merit, the most plausible system for the Christian is a sort of middle ground. On the surface, it seems reasonable to assume that the brain is the center of a human's being. Since the brain is entirely made of matter, this lends credence to physicalism. However, it is important to remember the Bible teaches that human identity persists after physical death. In Scripture, a clear distinction can be drawn between the body and the soul. The very existence of an afterlife should cause one to question physicalism, as it's very obvious the body doesn't last long after death. If your identity was completely contained inside your brain, you couldn't be transferred to a new form like your perfected heavenly body without some kind of spiritual brain transplant. Therefore, human identity must have some element of intangibility. Nevertheless, the importance of the brain should not be ignored. We agreed earlier the best option is a compromise between the two, and physicalism does have some merits. It's evident from millennia of science that the brain is the most complex and powerful organ in the human body, and its command over the functions of our body are incredible. It's completely through our nervous system that we interact with our surroundings, reason, and make decisions. These functions are consistent across all living things that possess a brain, but humans possess several that seem to be unique. The first is subjectivity, the idea that each person's life experience is unique to them. No one interacts with the world in the same way, and this is why everybody is different. Additionally, humans are capable of both interacting with ideas and synthesizing new ones. This speech itself is an example of synthesis. I'm evaluating, selecting, and then combining ideas to create what I hope is a convincing argument. These unique functions can be attributed to the mind, or soul if you prefer, the source of human identity. While the brain controls the functions of the body, your soul is what really makes you who you are. AI greatly resembles the brain and works in a similar way on a much smaller scale, but we should never expect it to produce anything but an imitation of higher human functions. LT might be able to imitate human emotions, like compassion or sympathy, but all she perceives for herself is a string of ones and zeros. She can know everything there is to know about human emotions, but she'll never feel anything for herself. However, as with all discussions of the future, we cannot speak with certainty on anything. It's entirely possible I could be wrong about AI, so let's consider a more optimistic future. Remember the story from the beginning? Over time, because of how human-like Elsie was, her owner grew attached and assigned value to her. A machine like her isn't human, but it could be very, very close to one. At this point, some argue that if there's no noticeable difference between the imitation and the real thing, then maybe there's not really a difference at all. If we look back at the Chinese room argument, we can walk away believing it doesn't matter whether or not the computer and Searle actually know Chinese. It looks like it does to the people outside the room, and that's all that matters. When technology begins to blur the line between life and unlife, one has to question whether the line needs to exist at that point in the first place. If Elsie acts like a human, talks like a human, and thinks like a human, then maybe she should be treated like a human, and her destruction should be murder. When it comes down to it, humanity has two choices. Either we give AI human rights, or we do not. There is no middle ground. When dealing with human-like AI, I believe that neither option is very desirable. To prove this, we'll look at two different futures, one for each choice. First, picture a world where humans and AI live side by side. AI has been seamlessly blended with human society. To many, this seems like a paradise, where the best qualities of humans and machines work together to advance civilization. But unfortunately, this future holds several ethical problems that challenge the core of human identity. As we know, the Bible teaches that humans are set above the rest of creation. But when humans and non-humans are treated the same, what happens to this uniqueness? What sets humans and non-humans apart when they can't even be distinguished from each other anymore? What happens to a person's uniqueness as an image bearer of God when a mechanical replica of him can be created that imitates him perfectly? There would be a tremendous struggle to understand what makes humans actually unique when every capability that sets them apart from animals can be emulated in a mechanical duplicate. There is only one way, from humanity's current perspective, to remove this risk. Avoid the creation of human-like AI, and continue to clearly distinguish between humans and machines no matter the similarities. Obviously, that world doesn't sound like a lot of fun. But if you're technologically inclined, you may be thinking, well, what if we make human-like AI but just keep it under control? If we created human-like AI and kept it under our control, humans could harness the power of such AI without the risk of compromising our identity. This sounds pretty reasonable, right? Unfortunately, this future is also a disaster in disguise. Remember what human-like AI is. It's a machine with the creativity, intelligence, and flexibility of a human, capable of almost anything a human can do. In this future, that machine is treated as a means to an end, as mere property. This is a world where Elsie's destruction would be destruction of property, and immediately forgotten about as soon as a new one can be bought. On the surface, this doesn't seem like a serious problem to us right now. But remember, Elsie seemingly is human. There are machines, indistinguishable from humans, that are treated as tools and property. And funnily enough, we already have a word for treating intelligent beings as property: slavery. Maybe it's a stretch to call the restriction of advanced AI slavery, but it's unquestionably a gray area. The question is simple but impactful. Do humans have the right to determine the lives of other beings just like them? It is beyond obvious that the ownership of humans is unequivocally wrong. It follows that the same should be true of machines that are just like humans. Now, at the end of the day, we must remember AI is not inherently bad. Like any tool, its worth comes from its use for good or evil, rather than any intrinsic qualities that may exist. AI is undoubtedly a masterful invention and a marvelous demonstration of human ingenuity, but it should be nothing more and nothing less. Drawing on both philosophy and common sense, we have shown two things. First, AI is undeserving of rights at this time. And second, a world where AI is advanced enough to merit a discussion of rights is not one humans should wish to live in. Rather than obsess over the possibility of AI overtaking humanity as the dominant species on our planet, or the necessary advancements to create synthetic life forms, research should focus on optimizing AI as it is currently understood and increasing its power so it can solve more complex problems. The march of progress never stops, and even if it might need to be redirected, that does not mean the technology as a whole should be thrown out. Modern society would be impossible without AI managing uncountable amounts of unseen calculations, and more sophisticated technology would allow for even more automation of basic tasks, so humans can focus on advancement and improvement rather than upkeep. The future is bright, and humanity's potential has never been greater. So rather than create confusion with ethical dilemmas and questions of identity, researchers should harness this tool to lead humanity boldly into the future. Thank you.